Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the fall lecture of the UL Carey Institute for Government Reform. It is called the Al and Frances Hochman Memorial Lecture, and it is made possible by a grant from the Hochman family. And we have two members of the Hochman family here today, Richard Hochman and his sister Carol. And we're delighted that they could be with us, and we thank them again, as we have in the past, and as we will in the future, for making this event possible every fall. Now, today is a day that we'll remember because of the lecture and the lecturer, but it's a day that we can't forget because of what happened on 9/11. We remember 11 years have passed and the essence holds, as immutable as the bedrock. The rage burns, the sorrow sears, the resolve grows only stronger. 11 years have indeed passed, and the time arrives to relive the moments that lasted forever and to reflect on what came after. 11 years have passed, and there is again union, no longer born of blunt trauma to hardened country, now risen from memory. 4 screaming jets perverted into missiles, we remember. 2 proud burning towers collapsed into malignant clouds, we remember. The symbol of American military might afire, we remember. The valiant who died in a field to save others, we remember. 2,977 people, we remember. We will never forget. Now, I will introduce one of our campus reverends and ministers, the one who is a graduate of Wagner College, class of 2006? Five, excuse me. Reverend James Smith, Pastor Smith.
Let us bow our heads for a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for this opportunity to once again gather together to celebrate life, to commemorate life, and to usher in this new era, this time for change. Lord, as already we have said, we will always remember and we will never forget. We remember you today, the loving kindness that you continue to bestow upon your people. Continue to give us your grace and continue to help us through the difficult times. We thank you for the opportunity to be spoken to by the Honorable Milton Mollen. Continue to give him the strength and give him the words that will touch these young people's minds and hearts so that we can continue to work for justice. Lord, again, we will remember, we will never forget of your love for each and every one of us. Keep us safe in your hands. We ask all this in your precious name we pray. Amen.
The person who's going to give greetings does not really need an introduction because he is so well known and so beloved at Wagner College. But I'm going to give him an introduction anyway. And I'm going to give him an introduction because the college and the Carey Institute, which is housed at the college, deserves so much. And this man has given so much, even more than it deserves at times, to make it a reality. He's a man of compassion, he's a man of strength, he's a man of intellect, and believe it or not, and I see some students from my class here, it is not because I willed the Carey Institute for Government Reform to be born that it was born. It was because this man, who I'm about to introduce, made it possible in the birth process to come alive. And for that, we owe him a great deal of debt. Just as we owe him a great deal of debt for being the outstanding president of Wagner College that he is for many, many years. And in October, we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of his presidency. May that double and triple and even more than that in our lifetime, because we owe so much to him. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to introduce you for words of greetings, President Richard Garassi.
Seymour is extremely generous, too generous. Why do we have a Carey Center? We have a Carey Center because government reform is an absolute necessity in the times we live. Government plays a huge role in the economy, in our lives, in our social lives, in the regulation of business and commerce, in the lives of quality of our lives every day. So having an independent government, a government that's responsive to people, is one that's essential for a vibrant democracy like our own. So we started the center because we believe that, in fact, there's a lack of government efficiency, a lack of government responsiveness in the world that you're now inheriting as young citizens. And so we wanted a center that would be completely nonpartisan, that would really look at government, how to get it to structure in a more effective and informative way. And that's why we have the center. And we've had a series of spectacular speakers, of which we'll have another one today. I'm so happy that Judge Mollen is here. And we've learned so much from people on the ground who have been participants in making government more effective, more democratic, more responsive. So I can't thank Carol and Richard enough for your sponsorship of this lecture. They're loyal. They always come from the far ends of the other boroughs to get here. And my goal is to get them to the right parking spot so they don't have to traipse over gardens and weeds and fences to get to this location. So now we've got that set up, I think, in the right way. And I think you'll thoroughly enjoy the speaker today. I can't thank you for being here. Now, I'm going to duck out at 10 to 6 because I'm hosting the faculty, all the faculty, for reception, for the first reception of the year. So if you see me leave, it's not because of anything anyone said, but because I have another obligation. But I'll be here for, I think, almost all of the talk and maybe some of the Q&A. So thank you so much. Thank you. Enjoy the class.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, our guest speaker. Judge Milton Mollen has served the state and city of New York, both in the judicial and executive branches of government, on the highest levels for over half a century. He capped his official career serving as the presiding justice of the New York State Appellate Court, 2nd Division, as well as deputy mayor of the city of New York. His public service was most pronounced during the gubernatorial administrations of Governor U.L. Carey and Governor Mario Cuomo, yes, Andrew Cuomo's father, and the mayoral administrations of Mayor Robert Wagner, Mayor A. Beam, Mayor Ed Koch, and Mayor David Dinkins, a foursome who probably didn't speak to each other that much when they were in the mayor's office. Earlier in his career, Judge Mollen occupied positions in the office of the Corporation Counsel of the City of New York, as well in housing and development in New York City. He began his judicial career in 1966, serving as the Justice of the Supreme Court of the State of New York from 1969 to 1975. Judge Mollen also served as chair of the Special Commission to investigate corruption within the police department of the City of New York. Today, besides working in his law firm, Herrick Feinstein, he is involved in numerous mediations and arbitrations in some of the most important cases in the city. He has been honored by the National Institute of Justice of the U.S. Department of Justice, New York University Law School, the New York State Bar Association, and the Governor's Council on Law Enforcement. He is a member of the board of numerous civic, community, and religious organizations. He served for 3 years in the Air Force during World War II. Even though it is not mentioned in his official biography, Judge Mollen's plane was shot down over Nazi-occupied France. He subsequently risked his life in escaping from a German POW camp and spent not only days, but I think weeks in enemy territory before he reached the safety of Allied lines. He was a great hero in the greatest war of the 20th century. It gives me great pleasure, and we are honored, Judge Mollen, that you are here with us today. You honor us by your presence. Judge Mollen might be blamed for one thing. Judge Mollen was responsible for my going into public life as well as academic life. When I became, it was several months ago, Judge Mollen, I remember, a member and president of the New York City Board of Education at the age of 35, I couldn't have been selected without his advice and his recommendation to those who made the selection. So if I've done anything wrong, Milt, it's my responsibility. If I've done anything good, it's your responsibility. And when I came to Wagner College, I think President Garassi will have to share that responsibility with you. I want to introduce to you now Judge Milton Mollen, my mentor and my teacher, who will speak on the topic, the major impact of New York Governor U.L. Carey on the state's judicial system. Judge Mollen.
Dr. Garassi, Reverend Mr. Merriweather, Carol and Richard, students all, the fortunate ones, the young ones in the room. Thank you all for being here, giving me an opportunity to expound on a subject that I have some fairly strong views about, and that is the quality and the kind of person that Governor U.L. Carey was and the service that he performed during his years in the state government, particularly as governor, as well as the federal government. He spent 6 years there, no, 7 years there in Congress on that. And I had the good fortune to know him in law school. I was one class in front of his class, and we were both at the same law school, and we had good memories there. I knew him at that time. Let me say this, that I've met many people in government life. You know, I'll start by telling you how sometimes you cannot be totally certain about what fate will hold in store for you. But when I went into government life, my first position was an assistant corporation counsel. I had done off-counsel work for the man who had become the corporation counsel of the city of New York, and he asked me to come into the office, and I kept saying no for about 3 months, and finally he kept after me, and I agreed to go in there. And people, my family, I was married at that time, I had one child, another one shortly after that, and other friends asked me, why am I wasting my time going into government at that time? And I said, well, I've been importuned by Mr. Hurley, and I said, and I'll go in for 2 years. I said, I wanted to be a litigator at that time, I knew I was meant for the courtroom. That's why I became a judge. And I said I'll spend 2 years there doing litigation. It's a heavy litigating office. And I said I'll learn something about municipal law, administrative law, and then I'll go back into practice. And then I did go into practice 42 years later. So your plans can't always be followed as a path that you think you're going to follow. Events, to a great extent, control what happens as you go along. I have no regrets for the 42 years I spent there, and had some good times. Those years, some of the years that were most significant and benefit to me as a person, and which I enjoyed mostly, was in connection with the career of the man that I'm going to talk about, Governor Carey. Because he was the governor when and he appointed me, in fact, as the presiding justice of the Appellate Division of the State of New York. It's a gubernatorial appointment, and he appointed me to that position, which I held for, I understand, the second longest time of any person who held that position. I held it for 13 years on that, and I never regretted those years. They were great years. But in any event, let me tell you about Governor Carey and indicate some of the reasons why I had such enormous respect for him on that. Governor Carey took office in January 1st, 1975 as the governor of the state of New York. He'd been a congressman, and then that was the first public position he held other than being in the military during World War II, where he rose to the rank of major in the infantry. Then, when he took office, the times are pretty difficult. We were facing an enormous financial problem. The city was very close to declaring bankruptcy. In fact, and I know for a fact it was being seriously considered by the mayor and his advisors. The mayor at that time was Mayor A. Beam, and the city's financial situation was desperate. There were all kinds of outstanding notes, and debts, obligations that the city had undertaken, some wisely, some not too wisely. And the time was coming when those obligations had to be met. The notes had to be paid, or else it would appear that the only other alternative was for the city to go into bankruptcy. And that was something that nobody looked forward to. The City of New York going into bankruptcy. The City of New York, which prides itself as not merely being the financial capital of the United States, but also the financial capital of the world, in essence, on that. And the thought that would have to go into bankruptcy and the consequential results flowing from that was something that were not looked upon very happily or very lightly on that. In any event, Governor Carey was elected to the position of governor in the election in 1974. No. And he took office January 1st, 1975. And the first thing his orientation lectures consisted of being told how drastic the situation was for the city in financial terms. And financial terms translate into human terms. If you don't have money for programs to take care and meet the needs of the people, that's where the real problem is. The fact that there's some other obligations as well is also important, but there's nothing more important than not having the funds to take care of the drastic needs, the urgent needs of the people of our city. Our city is a great city, but it also has great obligations. And we have people at all strata of economic levels, and many of them rely very heavily on the city to help them meet their needs. In any event, this was something that was not very happily looked forward to on that. Now, and at the State of the State message, which every governor gives every year, Governor Carey had to give his, and he did on January 7th of 1975. And he forecast at that time where the city was going and what the problems were. And I like to get the words accurate because I don't want to misstate his words. And he said at that time, in the very simplest of terms, this government and we as the people who've been living beyond our means, and there has been scarcely an activity, a category of public spending in which we do not lead the nation. What we did was limited only by our imagination and our desire. Our buildings were the tallest and most sumptuous. Our civil service, the most highly trained and paid. Our public assistance programs, the most expensive. Indeed, so lavish was the style of our government that we came to depend on it for life itself, forgetting that government was only the result of our industry and not its source. As the state's private community stagnated, government became the principal growth industry in New York. New Yorkers gainfully employed only then in 1958 at the same level of employment that existed in 1958. But those who want to hear our enormously increased boundaries and financial obligations, this was all done at the expense of government, and government had to repay those expenses and those borrowings. To pay for all of this, our taxes have since become the highest in the nation, and every interest group and advocate came to think of the same, to draw from that same budget. And our state subsidy of local needs seemed as if it came out of the cornucopia, with a never-ending horn of plenty that could stay open more and more each year. Now, the times of plenty, the days of wine and roses are gone, Governor Carey declared, in what became one of the most famous and trenchant lines of his career. Then he went on, we were in the lead car in a roller coaster going up, and we're in the lead car in a roller coaster going down. So we must first recognize the immediate burden we inherit. We do this not in the spirit of recrimination, nor in the criticism of any man or party. There is responsibility enough to go around to all. But if we would master our fate, we must first acknowledge our condition, which in essence he was saying we have to accept the facts as they are, and we must address those facts and do so in a way that enable us to continue in the best way possible for the betterment of all of the people of our city and our state. Now, he said, in essence, he said, let's look at the record. What kind of a man, well, I suggest to you, what kind of a man was the governor of the great state of New York who was about to tackle these very difficult circumstances? Hugh Carey was born on April 17, 1919. The third son of a family which ultimately consisted of parents and 6 sons. Being a middle brother in a line of 6 brothers is not exactly an enviable position. Hugh Carey looked up very much to his 2 older brothers. He was the 3rd brother to come along and respected them, but they had no respect for the little brother. And the youngest children, they looked up to the top oldest brothers, but had no respect for the middle brothers. So he lost out on both ends on that. During his time as a student in the parochial school, Carey, unlike his brothers, did not engage much in school athletics. He rather became an avid reader, and he was so for all of his life. He was an avid reader and seeker of the truth and seeker of knowing what was going on in the world and what could be done to better the world. At school, he was elected the class president, and he was also the student coach of the freshman basketball team. 2 of the highest honors to which a student could aspire to at that time. Hugh's father left formal schooling at the end of the 9th grade because of his desire to help support his parents and his family. There was an oil depot near his home, and he used to take oil at that oil depot and then sell it to trucks, cars, and railroad engines, which used to come into a transit station there. And he lived on a kind of credit basis. He would buy the oil, didn't have ready cash, so he would buy the oil on credit, and then he would sell it. And when he sold the oil, he would pay back the oil people who had sold the oil to him. And this was fine as long as he was able to continue that. However, the Rockefeller interests, who had built up Standard Oil and the fortune of the oil business and the railroad business, they decided that they would not extend credit to the people who came to borrow, to buy the oil, but not pay for it at the time, but pay for it when they sold the oil on them, because they wanted to sell the oil directly to the people themselves. It was part of their taking over the entire industry. And that's what they did. And therefore, they in essence drove Dennis Carey, who was the father of Hugh Carey, out of that business. And he faced very difficult times. Later on, his father received a job from Sinclair Oil, and he was ultimately promoted to a managerial position and was able to continue to support his family essentially. Then, Carey and his friends used to hang out on the street corners, as most kids did in New York City, and a store proprietor near there used to see them hanging out. He said to them, "What are you wasting your time hanging out in the streets for?" He said, "Why don't you join the National Guard? You get paid a few dollars for working there each weekend, and you're off the streets." So they looked into it, and they found out it was true. So they joined the National Guard, and were being paid a few dollars, which they used as spending money. In 1941, however, President Roosevelt decided, because he could see the imminency of the war that was taking place in Europe, and he realized, in essence, that he had to prepare the United States for its likely entrance into that war. So he nationalized the National Air Guard, the National Guard, and Hugh Carey and his friends who were with him were nationalized and became part of the armed forces of the country on that. Then, when the war started, he did what I did, he applied to the Air Force. But he had an eye defect, he had a problem in his right eye, and the Air Force wouldn't accept him. So he changed his objective to become a member of the infantry. He applied for the infantry, and he was granted the right to go into the infantry, and then he was fortunate, he was sent to officer training school, officer candidate school, and he became a second lieutenant in the infantry forces. Over a period of years, he served in Europe, he became a major, rose to the rank of major in the infantry, and he was there till the end of the war. One of the experiences he had, though, while he was in the infantry, had an impact on his thinking, and that was he was involved in the liberation of a slave labor camp, Nordhausen, maintained by the Nazi government, where people were brought in to do slave labor work from all different countries in Europe, and many of them Jewish, a portion were Jewish, but there were others as well. And they died in the camp. They worked there as slave labor till they died, and then their bodies were stacked up. When the American troops liberated this camp, Nordhausen, he found these horrible sights in there, and it affected his thinking in his life thereafter. He never forgot that. And he had a very great distaste developed then, which he carried on the rest of his life, for capital punishment. Because he put it very simply. He said, no government should have the right to decide to follow a course or policy whereby people end up by dying as a result of the government activity. So, and he was to his last days, he was a strong opponent of capital punishment. And politically, it was a very courageous position to take, because during the 1970s and early 80s, when he was governor, crime was a matter of great concern, and the legislators, some of them just thinking because it was the right thing to do, others trying to capitalize on the fears of the public, strongly supported amendments creating capital punishment. And at great political risk, he vetoed the legislation that was enacted to create capital punishment. He was totally opposed to it, and he stood fast on the issue. And in fact, in a great book that I reviewed again, I'd read it when I received it a long time ago, by a couple of authors. I think one of them is named Dr. Seymour Lackman, and the other is Rob Polner. And they told of an incident when Governor Carey was present, and when the press would have an annual dinner. They still do. Every year they have this annual dinner where most government people, top-ranking government people appear there, and the press run the whole show. And in it, during the course of that dinner, and Governor Carey was seated there, they took notice of the fact that he had vetoed the bill creating capital punishment on that, despite the fact that an overwhelming percentage of the public approved it on that. Well, he vetoed it nevertheless because it's a matter of conscience. It's a matter of conscience, a matter of religious belief. He believed he was opposed to capital punishment. Well, one was speaking at that point, pointed to the fact that Governor Carey was in the room. And the room burst into spontaneous applause and kept applauding, even though most of them probably had voted for the amendment to create capital punishment, but they applauded his courage and his adherence to his convictions as a matter of moral conviction that it was inappropriate, and they kept applauding until finally he stood up and bowed, and then they stopped applauding and he sat down. But it was a manifestation of respect for his consistency of opinion and belief, despite the fact that it probably hurt him politically quite a bit on that. But that was indicative of Hugh Carey. He was a person who would start out in a course, and he would decide what was the right course, and he would adhere to it, whether everybody agreed with him or not. For example, and I think that was a great reason for his success, but I passed over a certain period of time when I talked about what he did as governor, because before that, when he came back from World War II, he was at kind of loose ends. He started work with his brother. One of his older brothers was an extremely successful businessman in the oil business, became, I believe, he reputed to become a billionaire, and he was a very wealthy man on that. And Hugh took a position with him for a while, but he was not happy doing that. I believe in the first-hand information that I have, that he was not a person driven by a desire to make the maximum amount of money that he possibly could. He wanted to do things, for people, for the community. So after the war, for a while, he worked with his brother, and he left on that. And he decided, he received a letter in the mail, by now it was early 1960. He received a letter in the mail from his congressman, Congressman Francis Dorn, who was a conservative Republican, who had gotten elected, I think in 1954, had run 3 times for re-election and won easily. His constituency was an ultra-conservative constituency, and he was the only Republican congressman that time from Brooklyn. And he wrote a letter to Hugh Carey as a constituent. And he didn't know who Carey was at that point. It didn't matter. He was looking to get his vote. And he probably proclaimed how well President Nixon was doing in the polls they were doing. President Nixon was running for president that year. And he said that Nixon was ahead by 3-1 in the district. And was very proud, and Dorn was very proud of that because he was an ardent conservative Republican of that. Carey was turned off by that because he didn't think the people he knew from the district didn't think that way. So the letter kind of spurred him on to look into it. And he found out that at that time there was no candidate ready to run against Congressman Dorn. He was well respected and well liked by his conservative constituency, which were the majority of the people in that district. And none of the Democrats wanted to take him on, and the party leaders had made a decision that they were not going to waste any money supporting a congressional candidate. Whoever was going to be the candidate would have to supply his own funds. And in fact, Carey had gone to one of the district leaders in that district and asked him who was going to run against Congressman Dorn. And Carey was told, we don't know, we haven't got a candidate yet, but one thing we do know, the county's not going to spend any money on that particular district. And then he turned to Carey, back to Carey, and he said to him, well, why don't you run? If you're interested in the district, why don't you run for it? Well, he said, I'd think about it. And he went to see the county leader. The county leader said, if you want to run, you can run. I don't care, but we're not putting any money into your district. We're not wasting money. So Carey decided to run. And he went out, he spent some money. He bought a 1955 yellow Cadillac, had it painted red, white, and blue, and then he announced his candidacy. But he had a great campaign staff. At that time, in 1960, when he was running, he had 13 children, his own children. And he rented a fleet of Cadillacs, whatever it cost. He borrowed money from his brother. His wealthy brother really funded his campaign. And in each one of the 13 Cadillacs, red, white, and blue Cadillacs, he put one of his children. Each one had his own Cadillac. Didn't drive, but had the Cadillac on that. And went through the district. The girls, they had gotten their friends at school. The boys did the same thing. And even at times his wife went in one of those Cadillacs doing it. And the children would be very well, neatly dressed. The boys would be wearing their little blue blazers. And they became his campaign staff. It was an individual endeavor by the Carey family. The moral of the story is if you want to run for Congress, have 14 children, which is how much he had eventually. He ended up with 14 children, although he had a terrible tragedy. A few years later, two of his older children, two boys, were killed in an automobile crash out in Shelter Island, where he had a summer place. But in any event, in that campaign, running a race that everybody else thought was impossible, where he had a constituency that was basically conservative, pro-Nixon, Carey won by slightly over 1,000 votes. He became the congressman. And Dawn ran against him 2 years later, but Carey beat him again. And then he ran 6 times before he decided to make a career change on that. And probably no man ever used his intelligence, his ingenuity, and his common sense and sense of humor as well as Carey did as a congressman. He had a knack for making friends with everyone. He became a junior congressman, and he got on a pretty good committee. The chairman of the committee liked him very much, and he brought Carey along wherever he went. And even the Republican leader of that committee, the minority leader at that time, was the Republican, liked Carey, liked him because of the person that he was. They didn't agree on anything politically, but they liked one another personally. And in bodies of that kind, legislative bodies, that personal relationship becomes a very important factor. And Carey got to know a great many people there in a very favorable light, and he was looked upon by a great many people in a favorable light. And later on, it became very valuable when he became governor, because he made friends, for example, with later President Ford, was then a congressman. He was the minority leader of the Republican Party, and Carey made his business to befriend him. He also made friends with Melvin Laird, who was a close friend of President Ford when President Ford became the president. So he had a good connection there. And all of these relationships were built up. Carey had other ideas. He wanted to run for higher office, and he decided to run for governor in 1974. At that time, the party people had decided that they wanted Howard Samuels to be the candidate. He had the support of the organization. And Carey decided, nevertheless, to run against him. He took on all the political powers, all the political leaders of the state. Conservative Democrats, liberal Democrats were supporting Howard Samuels. In a poll taken by Carey's pollster, David Goff, statewide poll, 3%, one poll showed 5%, one poll showed 3%, knew the name Carey. Other than that, they really didn't know him as a person. They didn't know his accomplishments, but That was so indicated what he had to overcome. And he went out and worked at it. He had a very able public relations person, David Garth. They put on a brilliant campaign, and make that long story short, Carey beat Samuels in the primary by 3-2 margin. He became the Democratic candidate for governor, and then he had to run against Malcolm Wilson, who had been lieutenant governor under Governor Rockefeller, and he beat Malcolm Wilson very handily and became the governor of the state. Well, one would have thought that would make him very happy right then and there, but he had to face the debt. And at his inauguration, he then gave that speech that I indicated. Well, Carey used his relationships that he had with the Republicans of Washington. Mayor Beam had written to the president asking for help, financial help. And the Daily News, by some smart aleck editor, the whole front page was, President says to New York City, drop dead. That was the whole message, drop dead on that, to sum it all up. And indicated that they would not provide any federal assistance, because Beam had asked for legislation to enable the city to borrow money to pay back the money that they had to pay, the bond obligations on that. And it was a very desperate situation because everybody was terrified of the concept of the city going into bankruptcy. And in any event, Carey used his personal relationships with the Republicans as well as the Democrats in Congress to get them to persuade President Ford that whether he liked the city or not, President Ford took the position that New York was in the fix it was because they were profligate in the way they spent monies, and that they wasted a lot of money, according to President Ford, and he was not going to bail them out. He and his conservative constituents did not want him to do it, and he wasn't going to do it on that. Well, Carey actually organized people within the Republican Party not to openly fight President Ford, but to build a positive approach within Congress and an attitude within Congress to enable the city to get the funds, to get the debts paid, the obligations, the bonds paid for. And he succeeded. And the city averted bankruptcy, which it looked like was clearly heading for. And that was one of the great events when that happened, because the city of New York and bankruptcy was almost unthinkable on that. Thereafter, the president, the only other thing, there are a number of other areas, that was his great claim to fame, but he did a number of other things that were very important to the well-being of this country on that. But I don't have any more time. I really exceed, I think, the time I'm supposed to have. So I'll leave you with this thought that he was a great two-term president, and he was a great human being. I knew him as a human being, and I was very, very fond of him. And we had, I will tell you that in terms of his impact on the judicial system, he had a very simple approach. First of all, he made a great contribution to this state when he got a constitutional amendment through, which put the merit system into effect for judges of the highest court of the state. They used to be elected and controlled, elected by the politicians. Now, when there's a vacancy on the Court of Appeals, there's going to be one very shortly on that. It's a woman, and she will be replaced, but it will be by the merit system. There's a commission which will send the governor a list of people they find highly qualified, and the governor must select someone from that list. He cannot go outside that list. And it was a major contribution to the city, and Governor Carey pushed that through. That system not changed for over 100 years, and there have been many efforts to try to put in what they call the merit system. And finally, he was the one who succeeded, because it has to pass the two successive state legislatures and then be voted upon by the people. And he put it through that. It was an arduous task, and another thing that he did that he should get credit for now is that he applied a simple standard for all the top positions in state government when he was governor. Merit. That was the only thing he was concerned about. He spoke to people who had opposed his election when he ran, supported Howard Samuels, who was the candidate he ran against. He didn't care. Carey didn't care about that. Mario Cuomo ran for lieutenant governor with Howard Samuels, and Carey appointed him Secretary of State when he became governor. And many others they brought in would not support his candidacy on that. Richard Ravitch, who saved the Urban Development Corporation and then saved the transit system when he became chairman of the transit system, Carey had called him. He'd never spoken to him, and he called him and asked Ravitch would he serve as chairman of the UNDC on that. And Ravitch said, I didn't support you in the election. I was supporting Howard Samuels. He said, I'm not interested in that. I think you're the best person I can find. And he did that for job after job. He got the best person that he could find and put them in there, mostly young people. And when he had to, he went to the older persons too. He went to Felix Rohatyn, who helped him very much to get the bond issues passed through the legislature. But he applied one standard, excellence. When I was presiding justice of the appellate division, we had the merit system there, and they would go to, the candidates would apply to a commission. The commission would then submit to the governor names of those that they found highly qualified. They had to be found highly qualified. When Governor Carey got that list, he would call me up, tell me he's sending me the list, let me know who's the best of those who were approved by the commission. And I would talk to my colleagues from that particular county. They would tell me who the best candidate was. I would submit the name to Governor Carey, and in every instance, he appointed the person who I told him was deemed to be the best qualified of all of those candidates. He did that with important position after important position and many of the key jobs in government. He always wanted the best candidate he could find, the people he didn't know personally in many instances, but he would pursue them and convince them to come into government. And that's the way he conducted himself throughout. He really set a pattern. He was unique. He had a couple of faults, as we all do. And the press got on him. And I don't think those of us who understand and know government consider Hugh Carey to have been a great governor in terms of ability and what he did for the state and for the people of the state. But he served his 2 terms, and then he decided not to run again. And then he went in and did many things. I know he's been helpful to this school here. He's been helpful to our alma mater, the one that he and I attended. We're both graduates of St. John's University and the School of Law there on that. And he always retained his loyalties, and he was just a great human being with great sense of humor, and just he did a great service for this state on that. And if you want to do further research on that issue, I suggest you read Dr. Lackman's book. It's very simply titled, it's very descriptive. The Man Who Saved the City, Hugh Carey. I think that's the title, is it not? Okay. Can I sell you a copy?
Thank you very much, Judge Mollen. I think you have given us an abstract for the definitive biography of Hugh Carey, and I would be happy to serve as your research assistant if you have the time to do that in the future. Thank you very much. I want to thank President Richard Garassi and Professor Karen Garassi, his lovely wife, for joining with us. They have a faculty meeting at 6, but those of you who can stay, you might have some questions in terms of this excellent profile of Governor Hugh Carey and his stress and his emphasis upon excellence, ability, and the merit system. Are there any questions? Yes, sir. Give your name, please.
Clevie Tomsini. I wanted to ask, what could Governor Hugh Carey's mentality influence?
I'm sorry.
Can you stand up, Clevy.
Governor Hugh Carey's mentality, what could it bring forth to the federal government in today's world?
I didn't quite hear that.
Can you repeat it? Come up here.
Governor Hugh Carey's mentality, what could it bring forth to today's federal government, if used in today's federal government?
When you say if using the...
If you use Governor Hugh Carey's mentality and how he ran New York City, what could it bring forth to the federal government for today's world?
Bring a great deal forward, because his qualifications, they look for very simple: excellence, excellence, and integrity. By the way, in his 8 years as governor, there were really no scandals of any kind. People criticized, people disagreed with him, but there were no scandals, and his standard at all times was excellence. And I think historically, that will be perceived as a great accomplishment. He had no hesitancy about approaching people he'd never spoken to, but he went a great deal on the recommendations of people he trusted. That's one of the reasons that he turned the names of the candidates over to me for appointment to our court, because he trusted me and he knew that I might make a mistake, but it would not be intentional on that. And I don't think I did make a mistake. I always tried to tell him it was in the interest of our court to get the most competent people we could get. And he used that standard all the time. Rohatyn told him, I didn't support, Felix Rohatyn was another statesman in Wall Street. He was a partner in Laissez Faire. He was a major player in the Wall Street community. And he was surprised when Carey approached him. Carey said he'd never spoken to Rohatyn before he approached him to offer him the job on that. But he took on the responsibility. Carey, I haven't mentioned it because I was limited by time. I could go on at great length about Carey. But he had, in addition to being a very bright person, he had a very charming personality. That's how he was able to create these relationships with the congressmen, both Republican and Democrat, on that. And it enabled him to get things done that other people could not have gotten done, even though they had the same good intentions, but they couldn't persuade people to go along with them. Carey had the ability to win people over to his side. He was a charmer personally. You know, he had one thing, was like a concept, it never changed from the day I graduated till the day he passed away. When I called him about, on occasion, I would call him to tell him, congratulate him on something that I'd read about in the paper that he'd done very well. So we knew one another from school, and I'd call him. I'd say, Huey or Governor, that was a great thing you did on whatever it was. He'd stop me in midair, you know, and he'd say, no. He said, you know, my greatest claim to fame is that I succeeded you as president of the Student Bar Association at St. John's, which happened to be true. I was president of the Student Bar Association. When I graduated, he was in class in back of me, and he succeeded me. But he used that, he got a kick out of doing that. And he had quite a sense of humor. Not that that's necessarily an example of it, but he had a sharp sense of humor and warmth, personal warmth. And he got his adversaries to respect him and to like him. And he converted. President Ford grudgingly changed his position and finally provided the federal financial assistance that was necessary to get the city out of its mess without having to go through a bankruptcy proceeding, which would have been a horror.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Those who have left have classes at 6 o'clock, Judge. Those who are here can stay for a few more minutes. I want to personally thank Megan Marin for her job, her excellent job, in putting this together, and which we hope will continue into next year, since she's my graduate assistant until she gets her master's degree in 2 years. So we can rest assured, Richard Carroll, that Megan will work just as hard with your project next year for the fall lecture. And we hope to have, since the standard, the gold standard was set today, a speaker almost as qualified and experienced as Judge Mullen. We have time for one more final question. Thank you, Meg. One more question. Anyone?
Good luck to you all.
He preempted the question. Thank you very much, Judge Mollen.